And as you follow me along this morning, please keep in mind what one of my favorite biblical scholars, John Dominic Crossan, always tells people. It's not that these ancient people wrote down stories and were writing down literal events, and then we became smart enough through history to take them symbolically. They wrote them symbolically, and somewhere through history we became dumb enough to take them literally. People who are Unitarian Universalists come to Unitarian Universalism from many different places. Some of us come from Judaism. Some of us come from various forms of Christianity. Some of us come from other religious traditions. Some of us come from no religious tradition whatsoever. Resisting tyranny, evil, injustice, and oppression has always been part of our Unitarian Universalist tradition, going all the way back to some of our source traditions in Judaism and Christianity. With Passover and Easter upon us, not to mention Ramadan actually going on at the same time too, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at resistance in the tradition. Because the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition are both traditions of resistance to evil and empire and tyranny. Whatever your experience with the Jewish or Christian tradition, and whatever you know of it, you may or may not know that there is an incredibly strong strain of justice going throughout the entire tradition, all the way back to the beginning. Now, it is true the devil can quote scripture to suit their own purposes. So people can look at this many different ways, and people do. And some people use the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity to hurt other people. But there's another strain in there that's not really the chief strain you'll find if you bother to read all the way through it. It is a strain of justice and compassion and taking care of those who are left out, and fighting evil and tyranny. Throughout history, tyrants and empires, and even religions themselves have strayed from the path of treating others humanely, equally, with justice and fairness. Instead, religion can tend to focus on personal piety and obedience to religious rules. And that not only neglects the justice tradition that are in these religions, but it also neglects a holy, divine, sacred sense of acceptance of human beings, whoever and however they might be. Now, I'm not going to deal today with whether the stories and things I mentioned from the biblical literature are factually, literally true. For a very real sense, it doesn't matter for the purposes I'm going to talk about. The stories they tell are stories of a justice tradition. We don't have a heck of a lot of extra outside the biblical text confirmation of things we find in the biblical text to the later kings of Judah and Israel. Most biblical scholars who are not beholden to a literalism would agree that most of the early stuff in Genesis and Exodus is not historical fact, but important stories nonetheless. And as you follow me along this morning, please keep in mind what one of my favorite biblical scholars, John Dominic Crossan, always tells people. It's not that these ancient people wrote down stories and were writing down literal events, and then we became smart enough through history to take them symbolically. They wrote them symbolically, and somewhere through history we became dumb enough to take them literally. So right in the beginning even of the Jewish scriptures, the beginning of the Torah, in Genesis, there is a character, God, who's very concerned with justice. And we see this because in conversation, interaction with Abraham, God is expecting Abraham to stand up for justice. Example, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God says, and by the way, it doesn't have to do with homosexuality, Sodom and Gomorrah. The only thing in the biblical text is licentiousness. People are, whatever, doing what they weren't supposed to do, whatever. And God says, I'm going to destroy them all. And Abraham goes, excuse me, sir, but what if there's actually good, honest people there? And he's like, all right, if there are 50 good, honest people there, I won't destroy it. And Abraham says, what about if there's only 40? What about if there's only 30, 20, 10, 1? Abraham is always arguing with God about the justness of what God's going to do. And then we get to this really cool story called the sacrifice of Isaac, Akedah, the binding of Isaac, where God tells Abraham, sacrifice your own son. Seriously? Sacrifice your own son? But he does it. So God stops him. But God doesn't stop him personally. God doesn't interact with him personally like he's been doing so far. Instead, God sends an angel. Because Abraham failed the test. Abraham was supposed to stand up and go, excuse me, sir, but that's nuts. And he didn't do it. There's a justice tradition that goes all the way through this. And I believe there's even stuff in the Talmud about this interpretation of Abraham. And I know because I learned it from a professor in Jewish studies when I was in seminary. So that's really amazing stuff. Because if people have learned that before, they think Abraham passes this test by blindly obeying God's command to commit infanticide. And what God was really looking for was, excuse me, sir, but that seems ridiculous. And this strain runs all through the Torah and the prophets, especially the prophets. But my next stop is Passover. Passover is a holiday that celebrates the exodus from Egypt, the escape of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Great story, Stephen King, 10 plagues, locusts, frogs, killing of the firstborn, everything. Make a great slasher movie. The parting of the Red Sea, actually Reed Sea, there was a sea of reeds, a marsh, but that's another sermon. And as Walter Brueggemann says in his book, and in our reading this morning, Sabbath is Resistance, this is a story of a slave rebellion. This is Luke and Leah versus Darth Vader, and Frodo and Sam versus Mordor. This is the forces of good against the evil empire. And after this escape from Egypt, there's the giving of the commandments. And there are a couple reasons given for the Sabbath in the commandments. And this is where Brueggemann ties in his arguments in his book. And he says that one tradition says we celebrate the Sabbath because God brought you out of Egypt from slavery. And the other tradition says we celebrate Sabbath because God rested on the seventh day. And Brueggemann has us weave those two things together, that we celebrate a time of Sabbath. And this is my spiritual challenge for you for the month, by the way, to practice Sabbath, because Sabbath practice is an act of resistance. Why? Because the pharaohs of the world never want you to stop working. They never want you to have vacation or paid family leave or access to birth control. They want to control everything. And so you taking a day off, pharaohs don't like that. Never have, still don't. But the Sabbath is for everybody. Everyone deserves rest. Everyone deserves peace. And taking that rest is an act of resistance against the evils of empire, late-stage capitalism, injustices, tyrants, has been and still is. This resistance tradition carries all through the Hebrew prophets. I'll use an example that most of you might be familiar with. This is from Amos. I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I won't look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is God saying, don't be a bunch of religious hypocrites and come, oh, we worship God, and then you go out and commit injustices. This is in the prophets. This is all through the prophets. Hear this, it continues, you that trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain? And when will the Sabbath be over so that we may offer wheat for sale? We will make the ephah small and the shekel great and practice deceit with false scales and balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. God's saying, don't do that. What, you want the Sabbath to be over so you can go cheat people in the marketplace again? This is the empire and the Pharaoh and the tyranny and the oppression. It always was like this. And people still act like this. Our tradition is one of resistance. We're like, no, that is wrong. In the Jewish tradition, Hanukkah is a story of resistance. In the wake of Alexander the Great, as different Greek kingdoms are ruling the Middle East, they set up a statue of Zeus in the Temple of Jerusalem. And Hanukkah is a story of military resistance to that, of people fighting back and saying, get out of our temple and take your Zeus with you. When they rededicate the temple after their victory, you get the mythical story of the oil that lasted 8 days instead of 1. But that rededication is a story of resistance to a people that were taken over by an empire. Then we get to the Christian story. And a lot of people, I think, lose the tradition of resistance as it comes into the story. And part of it is we only hear the story in translation. So before we get to the Easter part, let me go through a little bit of what the tellers of this Jesus story were going on about. They use some fascinating language that kind of slides by us today if we hear an English translation. But for the people who originally heard the story, they would get it right away. Part of what the original tellers and writers of these stories used was the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And the word that we translate kingdom is basileou. And it actually is in Greek is empire. Because you see, when Rome conquered places, they would make a proclamation that the basileou of Rome has come to you. We've brought you the peace of Rome. Well, it's great for Romans. Not so peaceful if you're the conquered people, like the Israelites would have been at the time. So when the hearers hear the basileou, the empire of God, they're like, oh, wait a minute. A kingdom where we're supposed to treat people nicely and treat the poor well? And now that's different. And original hearers would have got it like that. Remember that Greek was the lingua franca of the ancient Near East after Alexander the Great. So even Romans considered, if you're an educated, well-read person, you spoke and read Greek. And when the Romans would conquer someplace, they would proclaim an euangelion, a good news that the emperor of Rome has come to you. So when these people, these Jewish folks who think that this guy Jesus is their Messiah, who's supposed to be a military and political Messiah, when they start talking about him and they say, the euangelion of God has come to you, we're like, oh, wait a minute. And if you had heard that at the time, you would have got that right away. Oh, they're playing off the stuff the Romans tell us about doing that differently. So they actually end up killing this Jesus guy. And it's an interesting death. Not that crucifixion was fun, but only certain people got put to death by crucifixion. First of all, no Roman citizens were crucified. That was not how they did it. So first of all, to be crucified, you had to not be a Roman citizen. And second of all, the only people that got crucified as punishment were people that Rome thought were a threat to the power and security of Rome. It is not Jesus Christ superstar, it is Jesus Christ terrorist. We have a lot of odd translations of this Greek text that say that this Jesus guy was executed between two thieves. Well, the Greek word is criminals. And if they were crucified, they wouldn't have been thieves because you didn't get crucified for theft. You did get crucified for being a threat to Rome. So this Jesus was crucified between two other terrorists, all threats to Roman security. And part of the difficulty of this Easter story is that for a long time, until very recently, last few generations, this Christian story has been used for anti-Semitic purposes. The Roman governor washing his hands of this crucifixion. Roman governors didn't wash their hands. They didn't care. They were like, he's a threat to Rome, crucify him. That was about how much they thought of it. It is not Jewish people's killing of Jesus. That's not in there anywhere. It was written that way. Why? Because the people who wrote some of these early Jesus stories, the earliest ones were all Jewish people themselves, and they were in an inter-Jewish war about how to be Jewish. By the time we start writing this stuff down, the Jewish Christians, the followers of Jesus as Messiah, Jewish people, and the other Jewish people were kind of starting to finally be at loggerheads, with the Jesus followers saying, don't associate with them anymore, we're different now. And the other Jewish factions, and there were many, were saying, yeah, those Jesus people aren't really Jewish anymore, they're too different. It's then that you get the language of Pilate washing his hands and the anti-Semitic strains coming in. But the tradition is one of resistance. Rome crucified this guy talking about the empire of God and treating the poor well and sharing what you have with everybody, and the kingdom of God being literally at hand, at your fingertips for everyone. By the way, it doesn't mean the kingdom of God is at hand, like it's coming soon. It means the sacredness and the divinity is right at your fingertips for everybody. Now, when people started thinking of this person as the military political Messiah, then Rome gets scared and kills its enemies. It's a story of resistance. As the Christian community grows up, one of the early stories is the Pentecost story. After Jesus' death, his followers disappear for a short time, but then all of a sudden they're all over the place doing the same teaching, resisting. Our early Unitarian and Universalist ancestors were different strains of that early Jesus movement. As early as the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, there were Unitarian Jesus followers, people who thought Jesus was great, but not a God, not the Son of God. And there were also early Jesus followers that were Universalists. They didn't go in for this hell thing. God doesn't punish anybody eternally. Eventually, those two ideas get named heresies. And remember that heresy, heretic, comes from a Greek word that means to choose. So all a heretic is someone who hasn't given up their right to choose what they think and believe. I am a heretic, thank you very much. And it goes underground, those two ideas, until the Reformation. If you know the story of that kind of history, Martin Luther is fed up with the abuses and corruption of the Catholic Church and says we need to make these changes, and he breaks away from the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and starts Lutheranism, which, if you've ever been in a Lutheran church, pretty much looks like a Catholic church. The service looks like a Catholic service, because Luther's problem wasn't with necessarily a lot of the theology, it was with the corruption of the people running things. But our people, the people of Jesus is a cool guy but not God, and the people of God sends no one to hell forever because loving gods don't do that. Those people were part of what was called the Radical Reformation. Not only did we want to break away from that corruption, we wanted to change the whole structure of our religious communities. Instead of bishops and hierarchies, we want us gathered here to be in charge of ourselves. The Radical Reformation. And one of the first really cool Unitarians that comes up as a resistance fighter is shortly after the Reformation, and of all places, the Principality of Transylvania, where a minister who was originally a Catholic priest, then became Protestant, then became Unitarian Protestant, he is at a debate called by the king in 1568. So the king, the prince actually, can determine what the religion should be for the country. And the guy who wins the debate is David Ferenc. And Ferenc's argument is everybody should be whatever religion they want to be, thus creating the first religiously free state in modern Europe. Until, of course, the prince and David Ferenc die, and the Catholic Inquisition comes in and starts hanging all the Unitarians and all that stuff. But it was a start. And all through our history, we are resistors. Hosea Ballou, one of the early prominent American Universalists, wrote a book called Treatise on Atonement, who said that Jesus didn't die for anybody's sins. Loving gods don't make anybody do that. That's a ridiculous theology. I can be okay with God if some other person gets tortured to death. That's ridiculous. Resistance. William Ellery Channing adopts the new biblical criticism, historical criticism, literary criticism of the scriptures that was big in Europe. And he says, God would not endow us with reason and then expect us to not use it in dealing with the scriptures. And shortly after Channing, you get the transcendentalists, who the liberal version of Christianity is still too conservative for them. And they're like, we're out of here. Everyone has direct access to the divine. That's Emerson's oversoul. Early suffragists were Unitarians and Universalists. Margaret Fuller writes a feminist treatise in the 1830s. Olympia Brown is the first woman ordained by a recognized denomination in the United States, by the Universalists in 1863. She was also one of the early suffragists who lived long enough to vote in 1920. Most of our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors were abolitionists, radical abolitionists. Theodore Parker, one of the most famous Unitarian ministers of his day, was in Boston, where he slept with a pistol under his pillow because the pro-slavery people are always trying to kill him. He ends up becoming one of the secret six funders of the Harper's Ferry raid and spends the last years of his life in exile in the South Pacific. He's also someone who wrote to a Southern slaveholder in 1848, attacking slavery and advocating violation of the fugitive slave law. He is also responsible for one of the most famous quotes by a Unitarian that is misattributed to other people, usually Martin Luther King and Barack Obama. But it's this: I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice. Theodore Parker, 1841. Unitarianism gives rise to American religious humanism, where it's like, let's leave the supernatural behind altogether, but let's keep the community and the ethics and the striving to do good in this world. More resistance. Our chalice symbol is born of resistance work in Nazi Europe, adopted by the American Unitarian Association in their work to help intellectuals and Jewish people escape the Nazis. Martha and Waitzel Sharp from Wellesley Hills, Massachusetts, spend a lot of their time in the late 1930s trying to do the same. They're over there trying to help intellectuals and Jewish people escape the Nazis. They are some of the only Americans, or a while I think they were the only American named righteous among the nations by Israel for their work helping Jewish people escape the Nazis. When Martin Luther King calls for people of faith to join him in Selma, somebody that responds is Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian from Boston, who's beaten to death going to dinner with some black protesters. And Viola Luiso, who was from Michigan, who was murdered giving rides to people back and forth from the protest site. Those are our people, resistors. Liberation theology arises in 1960s in South America. It's actually a Catholic movement saying God actually takes sides. God takes sides with the poor against the powerful, the oppressed against the oppressor. And our theologies in Unitarian Universalism have adopted that. Feminist theologies and black theologies and queer theologies, all liberation movements of resistance. Our LGBTQIA work is perhaps what we became most known for in the last generation. The law in Massachusetts that made marriage equality, the chief plaintiffs were Unitarian Universalists. It's our history of resistance. The move to ordain women in Protestantism started with us, and it grew with us. The UU Women's Federation and Women in Religions movement have expanded women's participation in ministry to the point where 56% of our ministry now is women. The only denomination more than half. In the early 21st century, we were at the forefront of immigration justice. Our now president, Susan Frederick Gray, was one of the chief architects of resisting Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Arizona, keeping undocumented immigrants in basically concentration camps. When Black Lives Matter started, Black Lives UU started and called us once again to be anti-racist. That's a lightning fast trip through our history, but it's a history of resistance that goes all the way back from Passover and Easter through the ages to us. So this is where you come in. And today, even this morning, the most up-to-date part of our history, you just wrote postcards of resistance right here. From way back then to right now this morning, you did it. So I ask, what part are you going to play going forward? Keep resisting. Keep fighting tyranny and oppression and injustice and exclusion and anything that hurts others because of who they are and what they believe. Not everyone is an activist, but all of us can support the activists. Someone, as it said, has to bring the food and make the coffee. So what's going to engage your heart to make a difference here in Southbury, in Woodbury, as we go forward? Perhaps we'll more actively engage some legislative work, connect to our Native communities, renew and re-energize our welcoming congregation and pride connections. And as this year winds into spring to summer when we tend to slow down, how can we make resistance a more integrated part of what we do in our work next year and going forward? We are a people of resistance to injustice. We always have been. In the future of resisting tyranny, oppression, evil, injustice, that's your history to write. It's your history to leave for the next people who come, to be one more part of that chain of doing what is right because it's right. Someday, peace will come upon us. And it will be because you were part of this tradition of resistance. Thanks a lot for watching this video. It would help me out a great deal if you liked the video to give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, maybe ring that notification bell so you can be informed when we put out other videos like this. Check out my website and blog at tonylorenzen.com for even more resources that will open your mind, touch your heart, and inspire your spirit.